Madam President, we are somehow continuing to consider the Democrats' grab bag of bad ideas, otherwise known, I would say misleadingly, as the Inflation Reduction Act. Let's start with the bill's title. It gets you feeling somewhat hopeful, doesn't it? The Inflation Reduction Act. Sounds like a bill that's going to address perhaps the number one problem facing our nation, which is inflation. And then you actually look at the bill's contents and discover that the bill will do nothing to reduce inflation. Nothing. And you don't have to take my word for it. Here's what the nonpartisan Penn-Wharton budget model had to say about the bill's impact on inflation. And I quote, "The impact on inflation is statistically indistinguishable from zero," end quote. Statistically indistinguishable from zero. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office also found that the bill would do nothing to address our current inflation crisis. So did the Tax Foundation. Well, so much for inflation reduction. So what about the deficit reduction that Democrats are touting? Well, unfortunately, there's a good chance there won't be much of that either. Democrats rely on some very shady accounting to reach their supposed deficit reduction number, most notably counting $120 billion in savings from the repeal of a rule that has never been implemented, and at this point was never expected to be. Madam President, no matter what this rule was predicted to cost, if it was never going to be implemented, its cost was effectively zero. And so repealing this rule leaves you with exactly $0 to spend, not $120 billion. Then there's the question of the bill's expanded Obamacare subsidies. Democrats' bill extends the expanded Obamacare subsidies by 3 years. But it's common knowledge that Democrats want to extend them permanently, as the President explicitly said in his State of the Union address. And when you figure in the cost of extending them permanently, most of the purported cost savings in the bill, which Democrats claim will go toward deficit reduction, dwindle away. So no inflation reduction, an extremely doubtful amount of deficit reduction. What else? Well, there are the hundreds of billions of dollars in tax hikes. Yes, Madam President, hundreds of billions of dollars in tax hikes. Our economy's posted 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. In fact, by any common definition, we are now in a recession. And Democrats think now is a good time to hike taxes on businesses that are already struggling with 40-year high inflation. The Democrats' book minimum tax, as proposed last week, would be a $313 billion tax hike, with roughly half of the increase falling on American manufacturers. Madam President, I don't think I need to tell anyone what happens when you raise taxes on businesses, particularly when the economy is shrinking. You get less growth, lower wages, and fewer jobs. According to an analysis from the National Association of Manufacturers in 2023 alone, the version of the bill Democrats introduced last week would reduce real gross domestic product by more than $68 billion and result in more than 218,000 fewer workers in the overall economy. The Tax Foundation also found that the bill would, unsurprisingly, reduce economic growth, reduce wages, and reduce jobs. In short, a big part of the burden of the Democrats' tax hike on businesses would fall on American families and American workers. And Madam President, the book minimum tax on American businesses isn't the only tax hike Democrats are proposing in this bill. They also just reportedly replaced a $14 billion tax hike on investment with a new $74 billion stock buyback tax designed to punish investors who choose to keep their own money invested in a business. A tax hike that will likely discourage new investment and have a negative impact on Americans' retirement savings. And of course, they've included a number of taxes and fees on oil and gas production. I guess Democrats would like our current sky-high energy prices to continue long term. Because I'm at a loss for any other reason why Democrats would choose to hike taxes on oil and gas production at a time when Americans are already struggling with high gas prices and high utility bills. Madam President, Democrats didn't always think raising taxes during a recession was a good idea. In fact, President Obama once said, and I quote, "The last thing that you want to do is to raise taxes in the middle of a recession," end quote. That from President Obama. Or as the current Democrat leader once said, and I quote, "You don't want to take money out of the economy when the economy is shrinking," end quote. Well, unfortunately, now that their Green New Deal fantasies are on the line, Democrats have changed their tune. That's right, Madam President. Democrats are hiking taxes during a recession, not to address our border crisis or inflation or rising crime, but so that they can implement their Green New Deal agenda. Their so-called Inflation Reduction Act is chock full of Green New Deal spending. Things like $1.5 billion for a grant program to plant trees. $1 billion for electric heavy-duty vehicles like garbage trucks, something that communities used to normally provide for. $3 billion for the U.S. Postal Service to purchase zero-emission delivery vehicles. And $1.9 billion for things like road equity and identifying gaps in tree canopy coverage. Yes, Madam President, Democrats are apparently willing to send us into a longer-term recession or stagflation in order to provide billions of dollars for things like road equity and identifying gaps in tree canopy coverage. All told, Democrats provide more than $60 billion in this bill for, quote, environmental justice. $60 billion. Now, to put that number in perspective, that's more than the federal government spent on highways in 2019. The bill also contains at least $30 billion in climate slush funds, part of which is allocated for, among other things, climate-related political activity. Yes, Madam President, climate-related political activity. Because for sure, there's nothing more that families struggling with ballooning grocery bills and the high price of gas are eager to see their tax dollars going toward than Green New Deal activism. Apparently, Madam President, is a very high priority for Democrats. I would say, in all likelihood, not for the American people and American families. And I haven't even talked about the tax credits and rebates the Democrats' bill would provide for wealthy Americans to purchase new electric vehicles or remodel their kitchens with Democrat-approved green appliances. Madam President, I could go on for a while here. It's difficult, really, honestly, to squeeze all the bad ideas in the Democrats' bill into just one floor speech. And I haven't mentioned the socialist-style price controls that Democrats' bill would impose on prescription drugs. Price controls that would result in fewer new drugs and treatments. Or the additional $80 billion. Yes, Madam President? $80 billion. The Democrats' bill would give to the IRS. The majority of it to boost IRS audits. Now that $80 billion, $45 billion of it would go to IRS enforcement. $45 billion or 57%. Want to know how much of that $80 billion would go to taxpayer services? 4%. 4%. That for an agency that only succeeded in answering about 1 out of every 50 taxpayer phone calls during the 2021 tax season. Madam President, $80 billion to the IRS for an additional 87,000 employees. 87,000 new employees at an agency that I'm told only has about 53% of its workforce actually going back to the office. 87,000 employees. You're going to have tax agents moving in with families around this country. Democrats aren't focused on improving taxpayer services, but on boosting the number of IRS audits. Madam President, no one should be deceived into thinking these increased audits will fall solely on millionaires and billionaires. No matter what Democrats and some officials at the IRS conveniently claim, the fact of the matter is that it's exceedingly unlikely the Democrats will be able to collect the revenue they want to collect from increased IRS enforcement without auditing small businesses and ordinary taxpayers. In fact, based on data from the Joint Committee on Taxation, somewhere between 78 to 90% of the revenue that's projected to be raised from underreported income would likely come from those making under $200,000 a year. So 87,000 new IRS agents set out with a purpose of collecting more revenue, allegedly, according to Democrats, from high-income taxpayers and businesses who are escaping taxation, and yet the Joint Committee on Taxation finds that 78 to 90% of the revenue projected to be raised from underreported income would likely come from those making under $200,000 a year. Well, Madam President, almost 18 months ago now, Democrats passed a massive partisan $1.9 trillion spending spree, which fueled inflation, record inflation, that Americans are still struggling with in this country. By the way, that $1.9 trillion spending spree was all on the debt. All on the debt. They didn't attempt to pay for it, just put it on the debt. And so now to talk about possibly reducing the deficit by what I think, when it's all said and done, in this bill will be under $100 billion, and that assumes all kinds of things, like actually they're going to raise revenue from these 87,000 new agents that they're going to hire at the IRS to audit American taxpayers. It also assumes things like the Obamacare premium subsidies are only going to be limited to 3-year extension rather than the full 10 years, which we all know ultimately is going to happen. In the end, I believe there will be zero deficit reduction. But the fact of the matter is, that piece of legislation, in addition to fueling inflation, adding to the debt, and having learned from that experience, I would hope, you would think that the Democrats here would not double down with yet another terrible economic idea, which is another tax and spending spree. And like the so-called American Rescue Plan before it, it will leave our economy and the American people worse off. For their sake, Madam President, I hope Democrats will think better of this bill before it's too late. And we're going to have an opportunity to debate it here probably in a few hours, and an opportunity to vote on lots of amendments. And we'll see what that process yields. But I can tell you one thing, the American people are tired of 40-year high inflation. They're tired of higher energy prices. They're tired of higher food prices. They're concerned about an economy that is in recession. And they're looking at a Democrat leadership in Washington, D.C. that has as its number one goal of all the things you could do to attack inflation, attack high energy costs, deal with a broken border, crime in our cities, deal with a wobbly economy. Their prescription, as always, is the same thing it is, no matter what the problem is, and that is raise taxes, increase spending, and grow government, all at the expense of the American people. Madam President, I yield the floor.